The child, clinging to the tree, stretched out his free arm, reaching for the ripe mango dangling in front of him. His thoughts not stretching further than sharing this treat with his friend. Only moments later, however, the young boy and his friend would be running for their lives, a race only one of them would win. This is the story of Jerobejin Van Wyk. My name is Jan Ruet, and you are listening to Wicked Crimes.
Please be advised that this podcast contains content that could be harmful to some listeners. This includes, but is not limited to, strong language and graphic descriptions of violence, sexual activities, assault, and death. This podcast also engages in discussion regarding various religion, spiritual beliefs, and practices, some of which might be harmful or triggering for some listeners. Please reconsider before consuming this content. The information contained within this podcast is mainly gathered from news articles and official court documents where available. Should you have any more information, or if you know of any incorrect information in this content, please feel free to contact the host through the email found in the show notes.
Before we jump into today's episode, I want to take a moment and congratulate the winner of our April giveaway, Leonie Kaiser. Leonie has won 2 wine glasses, a throw blanket, and a Wicked Crimes branded coffee mug, all sponsored by Clear Design. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at the case of Jerobejin Van Wyk. The first time I came across this case was through a social media post showing the outrage of the Klawer community pointed at the lack of service delivery from their local SAPX. Within days, however, the attention on the case would very quickly shift. This case would include racial inequality, various religious beliefs, and the contrast in childhood experiences between what we used to enjoy and how restricted children are today. Our case starts on the 2nd of February 2022 in the town of Klawer. Klawer is a small town roughly 3 hours drive from the South African mother city, Cape Town. 13-year-old Jerobejin Van Wyk and a friend found themselves walking down the street near their school when a ripe mango hanging in one of the trees caught their attention. The boys, of course, found their mouths watering, and very quickly they decided that whoever the tree belonged to would not notice a single little mango disappearing. Jerobejin, while small for a 13-year-old, did not waste a moment to start scaling the tree. While trying to grab their prize, however, the property owner exited his home and caught the boys in the act. Perhaps it was the stature of the short, grey-haired, big-bellied man, or perhaps it was the mango in the boy's hand. Perhaps it was the intense outburst of anger from the man. But when Jerobejin saw the man explode at him, he responded by teasing the man before leaping from the tree and making a run for it. The man, 56-year-old Daniel Hugo Smith, found himself enraged. Not willing to let the disrespectful little thief get away with it, he jumped into his Ford Bantam bakkie, or small pickup for those outside of South Africa, and set chase. He followed the 2 boys to a nearby depot. Here, he managed to hit Jerobejin with his car. After hitting the boy, Smith jumped out of his car, picked the boy up, placed him on the truck bed, got back into the car, and then sped off. The depot, however, was anything but empty. Multiple eyewitnesses had stood at the depot, frozen with shock and confusion at the events unfolding before them. When Smith had sped away with the injured Jerobejin in his truck bed, the witnesses managed to move. They quickly made their way to the nearby trash bin, where they had noticed the other boy had jumped into, and after hearing his story, helped him to get to the police station. Let's pause here for a moment. I want to take you back a few short years into the past. Your past, actually. Before the back pain, before the clicky knees, before the never-ending bills that somehow you ended up responsible for, when you were a carefree, smooth-skinned, tiny human. Did you ever play games like Ding Dong Ditch? Did you ever play ball in the street? Did you ever egg someone's house? Did you ever climb a tree that your parents didn't own? If you answered no, I know for a fact that you did something along those lines. Everyone did. I remember as a child, passing homes with fruits in their garden while on walks with my grandfather. This retired military man would carelessly pick any fruit he wanted and enjoy it then and there. While quite naughty, this was not an offense seen as severe in any way. It, however, seems as if somewhere in the 20 years between when I was a child until now, something major changed. These naughty little acts have suddenly changed from kids being kids to an offense which justifies the murder of children. In April 2023, a 6-year-old girl and her parents were shot in North Carolina in the US when they attempted to retrieve her ball that had rolled into a neighbor's property. Luckily, they survived. But we know the US faces high amounts of gun violence. So maybe this is an isolated incident? Except it's not. In January of 2025, for example, a 12-year-old boy on an e-bike was struck with a car by a neighbor in Australia who claimed that the boy had been playing Ding Dong Ditch while in the area. There is also a Netflix documentary about how a woman was murdered by her neighbor. This neighbor had been a menace to the community for a long time, becoming frustrated and calling police anytime a child in the neighborhood became visible or could be heard from her home. It seems as if globally the response to children stepping even slightly out of line has become more than a small overreaction. What scares me even more, however, is the fact that this type of reaction is becoming more and more justified. When the story of Jerobejin Van Wyk first broke, it was at this point. The community, general public, police, and Jerobejin's family had the exact same information as you do right now, save for the identity of the man that had attacked Jerobejin. The loud response from a very small group of people, however, was immediately that whatever happened to the 13-year-old child that simply wanted a mango would be justified. Remember the disrespectful thief comment I made earlier? Well, that would very quickly become a description for Jerobejin Van Wyk on social media. I've seen a similar sentiment being shared about other children in similar situations. In a world where we constantly hear about how children are no longer leading any life outside their screens, the reaction to them causing the same innocent trouble all of us did is that parents should not be allowing their children to roam the streets unsupervised, and should teach their children better. A reaction that I just cannot understand, but one that led to a 56-year-old man chasing down a 13-year-old boy. While the witnesses to this event was taking Jerobejin's friend to the police station, Smith had returned Jerobejin to the home that they had just departed minutes before. Here, Smith briefly spoke to his daughter. The reports I found in the case made it clear that his daughter had not only seen Jerobejin in the back of her father's vehicle, but that she had also told him not to hit the boy. I am not sure where she had gone after this. Smith, on the other hand, brought Jerobejin into his home, then offered him something to drink and a sandwich. As he stood there watching the child eat, Smith made up his mind and took the boy's life by breaking his neck. Smith then placed Jerobejin's body into a freezer before getting into the car with his daughter and heading off to a nearby town for their daily errands. When the pair returned home, Smith's daughter made them supper, which presumably did not use ingredients from the freezer. After dinner, Smith managed to give his daughter sleeping tablets. Once she was asleep, Smith removed Jerobejin's body from the freezer and continued to dismember him. Once the dismemberment was completed, Smith placed some tar poles in his fireplace and then started to add Jerobejin's body parts. The purpose of the tar poles is to raise the temperature in the fireplace high enough to cremate the bones. Even then, certain human bones would remain intact. Smith disposed of these remains by throwing them into the septic tank on his property. While Smith had been running errands, Jerobejin's mother had been alerted that her son was missing. As details of the day emerged, Teresa Van Wyk and the community was rallying whatever resources they could in an attempt to find Jerobejin. Resources which did not include the SAPS. By the following day, it was the community who took to the streets looking for physical signs of where Jerobejin can be. His story had started to spread across social media, and while the loudest voices were criticizing the Van Wyk family, the community kept putting pressure on the SAPS for assistance. 2 days after Jerobejin had been publicly hunted down in the streets of Klawer, police finally arrived outside the home of Daniel Smith with a sniffer dog looking for signs of Jerobejin. Unfortunately, this exercise yielded no result. The next day, Smith's neighbors started noticing a foul smell in the air. Complaints were lodged and a municipal team was dispatched to pump the drains in the area. The municipal team would only arrive yet another day later. As they stood pumping the drains, a worker looked in. The remains he would see in the sewage drains showed no hint of who they belonged to, but nobody had any doubt. Jerobejin had been found after 4 days missing. Smith was immediately arrested and would appear in the Klawer Magistrate Court the next day to be officially charged with the murder of Jerobejin Van Wyk. The community of Klawer, already frustrated with the handling of the case, felt themselves outraged. As Smith appeared inside the court, a crowd gathered outside, their anger tangible. It would not take long for the situation to escalate, and before long, police were firing stun grenades and tear gas into the crowd. Caught in the middle of the chaos was Jerobejin Van Wyk's mother, a woman who lost a previous child to a drowning. Now, stood in an unruly crowd, being fired upon with stun grenades and tear gas, because another man took a second child from her, all over a mango. Very quickly, allegations that Smith's actions were motivated by the fact that Jerobejin was not white started to arise. These allegations were fueled by the lack of service from the Klawer SAPS and the way that the community had been dispersed. When word of these allegations reached Smith, he instructed his newly appointed attorney, Santi Himan, to make a statement. This statement would be the match to light a well-fueled fire. Himan would tell media outlets that Smith's actions were not racially motivated. They were motivated by the occult. And Jerobejin Van Wyk was not Daniel Smith's first victim. During this statement, Smith's lawyer claimed that Smith had been introduced to the occult at the age of 13, while living in the nearby town of Vredendal, when an out-of-town visitor provided him with related reading material. This would apparently keep him interested in the occult until the age of 19, when an occult group in the Sea Point area of Cape Town taught Smith how to kill in such a manner that very little blood is spilled, before incinerating the body and disposing of the remains into the ocean. According to this statement, after being indoctrinated and taught how to kill, Smith had taken 4 lives in the Sea Point area. These claims would spread like wildfire. A story that started with a public attack on a child grabbed the attention of a nation when an outraged community had to search for the child themselves, made massive headlines when the child's remains were discovered, now dominated everyday conversations. At the point of publishing this episode, no new information has been made public regarding these claims, and no charges have been brought in regards to these claims. It very quickly became widely believed that these claims were made to move sensationalism in the case from the far worse narrative of racially motivated violence to an equally riveting narrative of satanic dealings. A narrative that South Africa has proven time and time again will work, thanks to the still present Satanic Panic. A claim like this is not a new tactic in South African homicide cases. One case I am extremely familiar with included a 17-year-old who murdered his parents' elderly neighbor. After his arrest, the teenager quickly made claims that he was a Satanist, that he had gotten indoctrinated to Satanism, and had even joined a so-called Satanic Coven in what was then called Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. The teenager claimed that this coven would often steal infants from public spaces for the purpose of ritualistic sacrifices. In that case as well, these claims were never substantiated, and a quick look at child kidnapping figures from the relevant time in the area that he mentioned does not support his narrative. Unsurprisingly, by the time the young offender would be sentenced, a local pastor testified that the teenager had since repented and returned to the belief of Christianity, but he now regretted his actions and should not be found fully responsible as he was under the influence of dark powers. The pastor's request in that case was unsuccessful, and the teenager sentenced to life imprisonment. On appeal, the teenager's sentence was reduced to 18 years, largely due to his age. As if following the same recipe, Smith's lawyer would take the obvious next step that I at this point expected. She approached her own religious leader, a Christian pastor, and asked him to meet with Smith and help to deliver him from evil spirits. In a surprising break from the norm, the pastor made it public that he is not only uneasy about meeting with Smith, but also that the so-called evil spirits cannot simply be exorcised, but instead requires a holistic approach to healing, which includes mental, social, spiritual, and physical wellness. The pastor finally also added that Smith is guilty and that there is not much he can do for him, The pastor also noted that his sympathies wholly lie with the Van Wyk family. While Smith had to abandon his bail application and ask to be moved to a single room in a different prison while awaiting trial for his own safety, Jerobejin's mother found herself in Cape Town for DNA tests to positively identify the remains of her child. In April of 2022, a month after Smith had taken Jerobejin's life, his lawyer had a psychologist examine him. The psychologist's report would eventually be handed into the court along with a recommendation that Smith be sent for a more complete and in-depth evaluation. The report the psychologist provided the court with would describe Smith as a loner, who is suspicious of the motive of others while being quite naive. A description I found relatively paradoxical. I failed to see how someone suspicious of others could be naive. However, I'll defer to the qualified psychologist in this case. In the report, the psychologist went on to share Smith's claim that he had become involved in some sort of Chinese occult at the age of 13. But during this time, he was taught how to do black magic, cast spells on other people, and yes, eventually became involved in Satanism. According to the report, Smith had a conviction that the occult gives him a power of control, as well as justification for his actions. Before we look into the report any further, let's pause here and look at the claims made so far. The first claim is that Smith had gotten involved in some sort of Chinese occultism. Smith and his lawyer never clarified what this means or what it involves. The fact that such a broad descriptor was used, and no clarification or details regarding this path of occultism was ever shared, means that it could be literally anything, or nothing at all. Coupled with the claim that this led to Smith learning how to do black magic, and eventually ended up involved with Satanism, an offshoot of the Christian belief system, it makes me somewhat believe that this claim was entirely made up. A sentiment shared by most who ever heard these claims. Whatever control or justification Smith claimed this had given him, sounds to me a lot more like it gave him control over the current narrative around his actions that were being justified by this. The report would further go on to state that Smith had done a comprehensive study on literature in all fields of religion, traditional rituals, and Satanism, a claim I would honestly like to challenge. While I would hardly call myself an expert on all religions and spiritual beliefs, I have had quite some exposure to quite a few different belief systems and a good deal of literature that accompanies these belief systems. One of the most common occurrences in all of these belief systems boils down to respect for yourself and those around you. I would go as far as to say that the only belief set I've come across that would not outright in one way or the other tell you to share the fruit from a tree with children in your community would be the ones to tell you not to do anything you would not want done unto yourself, or to not waste your time holding on to anger and grudges. I have yet to see any belief system that consists out of more than one small group of friends, but outright encourages its followers to actively cause harm. To further confuse matters, the report also stated that Smith believed himself to have a contract with the occult, Satan, and God all at the same time. This is another claim I'd like some clarity on. Seeing that the occult is an umbrella term, it would be quite interesting to know what Smith meant by having a contract with the occult. And more accurately, what exactly the contract with the occult is. But to further look at this claim, Smith also alleged having a contract with both God and Satan at the same time. Now, I'm not sure about you, but have you ever heard of God and Satan making a contract with the same person over a long period of time without punishing the person for being in league with the other? In fact, in no belief system or any form of mythology I've come across has someone been able to hold an agreement with the embodiment of good, evil, and an additional third choice. Just to be clear, however, I do believe that Smith had looked into different belief systems, and he may even have adopted some of the practices he learned about into his own belief system and life. I do not, however, believe that he had extensive knowledge about any belief system. Instead, he probably had some surface-level knowledge from a handful of books he believed encompassed every possible belief system out there. To round out the report, the psychologist reported that before Smith had even turned 15, he had committed a series of serious assaults. The psychologist would say that there had been various manifestations of psychopathy, which included a lack of real feeling, a lack of remorse, self-justification of his action, lies, disassociation of major events, manipulation, cruelty, and more. The implication here, of course, is that these violent tendencies only started after Smith had gotten involved in some form of the occult. In fact, the report would further state that Smith only felt real acceptance after getting involved in what he called Chinese occult rituals, and that since his involvement he has enjoyed power in social interactions and felt justified in his anger, rage, and retaliation. If at this point you start feeling like these claims don't fully track, you're not alone. A month after committing a horrible, cold-blooded murder, when being accused of racism, Daniel Smith decided that Satanism would be a lesser crime. While I believe that he had probably shown a lack of emotional control and high levels of anger and violence throughout his life, I do not believe Smith had committed previous murders, or that his problematic behavior was caused by an interest into the occult. Journalists covering the story obviously wanted to get more information, and they quickly dug into Smith's history. Through interviews with neighbors and colleagues, his story started to emerge. Smith's colleagues from his years of working on the railways remembered him as someone with unpredictable moods, who you would not want mad at you. While his mood was a bit of an issue, Smith would often bring homemade bread to work, make his own soap, and even do some carpentry. The odd behavior would show its face again each day at lunchtime, when Smith would disappear into a field with a bag for what he called his prayer sessions. Smith was also known to be a consumer of true crime media, with a fascination for serial killers. Now, I know what you're thinking already. Anyone consuming true crime media? Well, that is absolutely normal and there is nothing wrong with it. No, seriously, having a fascination with true crime is not a bad sign, unless you turn around and commit a murder, and then use your true crime knowledge to try and cover it up. Smith would eventually be ordered to undergo a full 30-day psychiatric evaluation. Unfortunately, it would take more than a year for a bed to become available for him. When the evaluation was finished, Smith was found to be fit to stand trial and to have been mentally fit enough at the time of committing the crime to be able to be held responsible for his actions. In early October 2024, more than 2 years after Jerobejin's murder, Daniel Smith attempted to plead guilty. The charges against Smith was murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, violating a corpse, and defeating the ends of justice. The issue, however, was that instead of pleading guilty to attempted murder as well, Smith tried to plead guilty to an alternative charge of reckless and negligent driving. The plea was rejected and Smith's trial would continue. During the trial, Smith's daughter was called as a state witness. In her testimony, she admitted to seeing someone in the bed of her father's car on the day of Jerobejin's murder, but claimed that she didn't take notice of it. She also said that when she saw a small boy with her father, she told him not to hit the child. I want to stress here that my sources in this case are entirely from news reports. While they're usually accurate, the information can sometimes be a bit incomplete. So while I entirely believe that Smith's daughter may have seen the child with her father, if she had any idea that the child was there under duress, or that he was in danger of losing his life, that information would have been exposed during the trial and she would have been charged as well. There is also a plausible explanation that Smith's daughter had seen her father with the child and assumed that he would be contacting the child's parents. When they had left for their errands, she could have been under the impression that the child had left the property alive and well. Smith's daughter also testified that her father had told her it is good to believe in Satan, quote, because you get what you want, end quote. On the 21st of October 2024, Daniel Smith was found guilty on all charges against him. A month later, his sentence would be handed down. Judge Haley Slingers delivered the sentence, and she had a bit to say. She started by pointing out that during the trial, Smith had claimed that while he was watching Jerobejin eat, something just came over him, compelling him to murder the child. This meant that the acts of pursuing, hitting, and kidnapping the child was done while Smith was still in control of his senses. She also pointed out how neither Smith nor his defense was able to explain what the so-called it was that had overcome him. Quote, therefore, even if the accused acted under the influence of the occult, which was not established on the facts presented, the circumstances of this case are such that on its own it would not constitute a mitigating factor. Judge Slingers also looked at how Jerobejin's family was impacted by his murder. This was certainly the most heartbreaking part of the case for me. As you recall, I told you earlier that Jerobejin had lost an older sibling. In 2010, his brother Adrenal drowned at the age of 5. Jerobejin Van Wyk had already lost 2 children before they reached adulthood. A fact that would make the following statement just that much worse. Quote, the mother of the deceased, Jerobejin Van Wyk, prepared a letter for the court. She was too emotionally fragile to read it out herself, and a community member read it out on her behalf. Her pain and sorrow leapt out of the pages, as did her search for answers. It is clear from the letter that the murder of Jerobejin impacted on his entire family. His sister left school, and according to the mother's letter, is now living a reckless life. His grandmother's health rapidly deteriorated, resulting in her death. Jerobejin Van Wyk looks like a broken woman. The suffering she experienced is visible in her very being. I cannot and do not want to imagine her suffering and pain as she is living every parent's nightmare. It is clear that the trajectory of the Van Wyk family's life has forever been changed as a result of the accused's action. End quote. Smith was handed a sentence of life imprisonment for the murder of Jerobejin Van Wyk. 15 years on the charge of attempted murder. 10 years for kidnapping, 5 years for violating a corpse, and 3 years for defeating the ends of justice, all to be served concurrently. This means Smith would be eligible for parole after serving 25 years of his sentence. During his trial, Smith indicated that he wanted an order granted for his vehicle to become the property of the Van Wyk family, as an attempt at some form of reconciliation. I don't know how the Van Wyk family felt about this, but unfortunately they would never get a chance to decide for themselves. 10 months after Smith was sentenced, his vehicle was forfeited to the state. The forfeiture was done on the basis that the vehicle had been used during the commission of a murder. When the state seizes assets, the asset is then immediately placed in the care of a curator. Once a permanent forfeiture order has been granted on any asset, the asset becomes the legal property of the state. The asset is then sold at market value. From the funds of this sale, the curator's expenses in regards to the seizing and storage of the asset, as well as their fees, are paid immediately. Whatever funds remain after this are then deposited into the criminal asset recovery account. From this fund, identifiable victims can then claim to recover any monetary losses they may have suffered during the course of a crime. This step usually only occurs in financial crimes such as fraud. The other uses for this account is to fund certain law enforcement agencies and NGOs like shelters for women. Unfortunately, given the fact that Jerobejin was not the primary breadwinner of the house, and the market value on Smith's vehicle is not very high at all, I doubt the Van Wyk family would ever be able to successfully claim from the fund. The Van Wyk family has been irreparably wounded. Jerobejin Van Wyk, a 13-year-old boy who just wanted a mango, was brutally hunted down and then murdered. While an entire community was out searching for him, Daniel Smith was doing his best to hide his own tracks. When his actions were uncovered, Smith took two of his interests and spun an interesting tale rooted in just enough truth to make it plausible. But in the end, neither the court or the public believed for a moment that Smith had suffered from some sort of spiritual confusion. Whether we believe Smith in his spiritual battle or not, however, does not change the facts. Jerobejin Van Wyk lost his life. His grandmother was so heartbroken that her body could not continue going. His sister, unable to deal with the pain, has lost her way and is now lashing out, causing her mother, who has had to deal with more loss than anyone should in the past few years, to lay awake at night wondering about the safety of her last surviving child. When we talk about true crime cases, it is so easy to get caught up in the actions of the victim, the history of the perpetrator, the excitement of the headlines, and so much more. But we often miss the secondary victim, the family who in their worst moment have to pick up the pieces and try to move on. When you listen to the story of Jerobejin Van Wyk's short life, the message I want you to take from it is the next time a kid in the neighborhood annoys you, don't react in anger, but rather think about what you were like at that age, what you got away with, and what you learned from those formative years. I'm the first person who would avoid a gathering because there will be children there. But I also don't believe a family should be ripped apart because a child saw a juicy fruit in the tree and wanted a bite. Jerobejin Van Wyk's principal described him as a quiet and shy boy, whom just like any other child, could be naughty if he really wanted to. Jerobejin was not a menace. He was not a criminal. He was a child. A child I hope rests in eternal peace, with all the mangoes he could ever want. A child, I'm hoping, looks after his family from the great beyond and keeps them safe from any further pain. And that, dear listener, brings us to the end of episode 11. Thank you for listening, and until next time, be safe, wicked listeners.